She stood behind the screen door, watching her father shake a stranger's hand on the porch, not knowing that handshake decided everything. 25 unspoken rules governed that night alone. By the middle of the decade, dating in America had become a language with its own grammar, and every young person in the country was fluent in it whether they wanted to be or not. The rules were never posted on a wall anywhere. They were absorbed slowly, from etiquette columns in magazines like 17, from mothers coaching daughters quietly at the kitchen table, and from the real social consequences of getting one small step wrong in front of the whole school. This is that whole hidden rule book. Rule 1 was simple and absolute. The boy called the house, never the girl. He would ask for her by name over the line, and more often than not, her father picked up the receiver first. A young man who wanted to take a girl to a Friday night dance had to survive a father's careful questioning before he ever even heard her voice, and everyone in town understood that this was simply how it worked, no exceptions made for nerves or shyness. That rule was never really about control for its own sake, even though it can look that way from a distance. A father who spoke to the young man first was vetting him in real time, listening for how he carried himself before the boy ever set foot near his daughter. It told the young man plainly that this family paid attention and expected to be treated with respect. It told the girl just as clearly that someone besides herself was watching out for her welfare that evening. What got lost when that rule quietly disappeared wasn't really the phone call itself. It was the built-in moment where a family looked a suitor in the eye before anything else could happen between him and their daughter. Today, a first message can arrive at midnight from a stranger with no real name and no real address attached to it at all. And there's nobody standing between that message and the person reading it alone in a dark room. No vetting, no porch, no handshake. Rule 2. He arrived at the front door on foot, and he never once honked the horn from the driveway. A boy who sat out in his car tapping the horn was announcing to the whole quiet street that he didn't respect the family enough to walk up and knock properly. Girls talked about a single horn honk for weeks afterward, and it was the kind of small slight that could quietly end a courtship before it had even really begun in earnest. The walk to the door was really the entire point of the ritual. It gave the girl's parents one more careful look at him, standing there in the light, gave the neighbors something respectable to see through their own front windows, and gave the girl herself a small private ceremony before the evening had even properly started. Skipping that walk wasn't read as simple laziness. It was read, harshly, as a statement that he didn't think she was worth the extra 30 seconds it would cost him. Rule 3 governed money without a single word ever being spoken about it directly. The boy paid, quietly and completely, and the girl never once reached for her own purse at the table. Etiquette guides of the era, including Amy Vanderbilt's widely read 1952 manual, spelled out in careful detail exactly how a young woman should decline gracefully if he insisted on covering even something as small as a stick of gum from a corner drugstore. A date in the early 1950s, dinner, and a picture show together for two people could run somewhere around $2 to $5 total, which was a real dent in a young man's after-school wages back then. Paying wasn't really about showing off in front of anyone watching. It was a quiet, practical promise that he had planned ahead, saved a little, and taken the whole evening seriously enough to budget for her comfort before he'd even picked up the phone. When that rule eventually faded from American life, it took something with it besides the check itself. It took away one of the few clear, unambiguous signals a young woman had that a man had actually planned ahead for her, thought about her comfort, and budgeted with her specifically in mind. Ambiguity crept in to fill that space, and a simple gesture that used to answer the question of intention before it was even asked out loud stopped answering anything at all. Rule 4. The first several dates were almost never a couple alone together in a car or a restaurant booth. Double dating, going out as two couples at once, was the respectable default option, and it wasn't only there for the sake of appearances in front of the neighbors. It genuinely took the pressure off two young people who barely knew each other and might have had absolutely nothing to say if they'd been left alone together too soon. Historians who study this particular period describe double dating less as a clever chaperone workaround and more as its own genuine, standalone social pleasure, four good friends together at a drive-in instead of two nervous strangers forcing a stiff conversation across a diner table. It softened the natural awkwardness of early courtship into something that felt, on a good night, more like a party among friends than a formal interrogation with only one right answer. Rule 5. Curfew was never treated as a gentle suggestion. It was a countdown the entire evening was built around from the first phone call onward. 10 or 11 o'clock on a school night was fairly typical across most households, and in plenty of homes the porch light itself did all the talking that needed doing, left burning bright, to mean keep waiting a little longer outside, switched off in an instant, to mean the evening was firmly, finally over. A father flicking that porch light switch off didn't need to open the front door and say a single word to make his point. Every teenager on the entire block understood the signal instantly and without confusion, and the boy still lingering hopefully on the front step knew exactly, precisely what it meant for him. It was discipline delivered without ever raising a voice, and it worked reliably because the whole community had quietly agreed to read that one small signal the exact same way. Rule 6 sat quietly underneath nearly every other rule on this whole list. Your reputation belonged to the entire town, not just to you personally, and never only to you. Word moved through church socials, crowded school hallways, and family dinner tables faster than any telephone line ever could. And a girl's standing in the community could be shaped for years to come by a single evening someone else decided was worth talking about at length. That's precisely why public affection stayed so carefully restrained, even between couples who were seriously and steadily together for months. Hand holding out in the school hallway was considered safe territory. Anything more than that, in full view of classmates or watchful neighbors, carried real and lasting social risk, the kind that could quietly follow a young woman well into her 20s in a town small enough for everyone to remember. Rule 7, and this one genuinely surprises most people today: playing the field, dating several different people casually before choosing just one, was actually the approved and encouraged strategy for most of the early part of the decade, not some kind of accidental fallback. Etiquette columnists in national magazines openly recommended it to their teenage readers. Going steady with a single boy far too early was viewed by many watchful parents as reckless, even a little bit cheap by the standards of the day. That order of operations surprises most people today, because pop culture nostalgia remembers going steady as the wholesome, unchanging heart of the whole 1950s. It really wasn't the starting point of a young person's dating life at all. It was the destination, something a couple worked steadily toward together and genuinely earned over time, and mothers who had come of age themselves playing the field sometimes worried openly when their own daughters skipped straight ahead to going steady far too fast. Rule 8. When a couple did finally decide together to go steady, that decision had to be made visible to the entire world around them right away. A boy's ID bracelet clasped onto her wrist, or his heavy leather jacket draped warmly around her shoulders in the crowded hallway, told the entire school absolutely everything it needed to know instantly, without either one of them ever having to say a single sentence out loud to anyone about it. That jacket carried roughly the same social weight a diamond ring carries in a relationship now, maybe even more given how public it was every single day. No formal announcement was ever needed, no lengthy explaining required, just a girl walking confidently into homeroom wearing a boy's jacket, and the entire student body understanding instantly and completely that she was spoken for. It was a kind of clarity you could genuinely see from clear across a crowded, noisy hallway. Rule 9 involved a small, almost secret little craft that nobody really talks about anymore: shrinking a boy's oversized class ring down so it would actually fit her much smaller finger. Girls carefully wound soft Angora yarn or plain tape around the inside band until it held tight and comfortable, and the specific color of yarn a girl chose sometimes became a quiet little signature all her own within her tight circle of friends. It was a tiny act of homemade, resourceful problem-solving that quietly turned a boy's own ring into hers without spending another single cent on it, and it meant that every girl going steady was, in her own small way, physically altering a piece of him just to make it fit her own hand perfectly. What got lost over the decades was that particular, tender kind of devotion, one expressed patiently in yarn and thread instead of in words or grand gestures. On college campuses specifically, Rule 10 took the humble ID bracelet a full step further into something more formal, pinning. A fraternity brother gave his own pin to the girl he genuinely intended to marry someday, and the whole announcement happened not through some quiet private conversation between the two of them, but through a surprise nighttime serenade outside her sorority house, his fraternity brothers singing together beneath her very own window in the dark. Inside the sorority house itself, a single lit candle was passed carefully hand to hand from one sister to the next, around a full circle, and the girl who was actually being pinned that night had no real idea it was coming until the flame finally reached her own hands. When she blew that candle out, the whole room erupted into celebration at once, because that single breath was the announcement itself. Nobody in the room had to say one word. Pinning sat on its very own distinct rung of the courtship ladder, a serious step clearly below full engagement, but well above simply going steady with someone, and it only ever existed for the roughly 1 in 10 college students who actually belonged to a fraternity or sorority chapter. For everyone else on campus and off, other equally meaningful rituals carried that same emotional weight in their own quieter, less ceremonial ways. Rule 11 was about the doorstep interview that nobody ever actually called an interview out loud. Before the very first real date, a young man was expected to state, clearly and out loud, standing right there in front of her parents, exactly where the two of them were going that evening, and precisely what time he would have her safely back home again. It was a formalized promise, delivered while standing upright. Handshake included as a matter of course. That short exchange on the porch did real, meaningful work underneath its simple surface. It gave her parents a concrete plan they could reasonably hold him accountable to later that night, and it gave him a genuine chance to show, right away, that he was organized, responsible, and serious before a single minute of the actual date had even happened yet. A boy who fumbled that moment badly rarely got a second invitation back through that same front door again. Rule 12. The drive-in theater was both the single most beloved date destination in the entire country and at the very same time the most quietly worried about by parents everywhere. At its peak in the late 1950s, more than 4,000 drive-in theaters dotted American highways from coast to coast, and the sheer privacy of a family car parked out in the dark was exactly what made so many watchful parents genuinely uneasy about the whole arrangement. That underlying tension, a beloved date spot doubling as a genuine parental headache, tells you something quietly true about the whole era. The rules existed precisely because young people wanted real privacy just as badly then as they still do now, decades later. The drive-in was where the entire rulebook and real, ordinary teenage desire quietly collided, week after week, every single Friday and Saturday night across the country. Rule 13 concerned the telephone itself, and it wasn't only about who dialed the number first between them. A nice girl, especially earlier on in the decade, was not supposed to call a boy's house at all under any circumstances, not even to simply return a missed call from him. She waited patiently instead, and that quiet waiting itself was treated seriously as a genuine test of her character and good breeding by everyone watching. By the late 1950s, that particular rule had already started to loosen its grip a little, and advice columns in national magazines began quietly allowing a girl to return a missed call from a boy without any real shame attached to it anymore. It's a fairly small shift on its surface, but it's also an early crack running through the whole rigid structure. Real proof that even the most ironclad rules eventually bent, once enough girls simply stopped following them. Rule 14. A girl actually controlled the shape of the evening far more than the public script ever really let on to outsiders. She decided quietly which invitations to accept warmly and which ones to let pass without much comment, and exactly when to mention a promising new boy's name at the family dinner table in a way designed to signal her parents should pay closer attention. The man led the whole thing on paper. She steered carefully underneath it the entire time. Etiquette manuals of the period spent page after careful page teaching young women exactly how to make a hopeful suitor feel like he had done all the choosing himself, when in actual practice she had already quietly decided which boys earned a second chance and which ones stopped being invited back at all, gently and without fuss. It was a real kind of agency, simply dressed up carefully in the polite language of modesty and deference. Rule ending an evening properly at the front door had its own careful unspoken choreography that both people understood without discussion. A brief kiss on the front step, if it happened at all that night, was short and was expected to end well before the porch light, or a curious parent watching from behind a curtain could turn the moment into tomorrow's topic of conversation across the whole neighborhood by breakfast. A boy who lingered too long on that step, or a girl who quietly let him, risked exactly the kind of talk Rule 6 had already warned everybody about earlier. The doorway goodnight was its own small, careful performance, brief enough to remain thoroughly respectable in the eyes of the whole street, yet still warm enough to make the very next phone call, whenever it finally came, feel genuinely worth the wait. Rule 16. Breaking up carried its own quiet ritual too, and it almost never involved a hard, drawn-out conversation between the two people. Quietly returning the ID bracelet, the class ring, or the letter jacket was, all by itself, the fully understood signal to everyone that a couple was over for good. No confrontation was required at all, no dramatic scene at school the next morning, just an object simply handed back without much said. That silent handoff spared both young people the real humiliation of a public audience, since the news would inevitably travel through the entire school within a single day, regardless of how it happened. Returning the jacket quietly and in private meant the couple themselves, not the school rumor mill, got to control how and exactly when their story finally got told to everyone else. It was, in its own careful way, mercy disguised neatly as ordinary etiquette. Rule 17. Fashion itself functioned as a genuine, real courtship signal all on its own. The poodle skirt and the crisp, tidy sweater set, both hugely popular through the middle years of the decade, weren't only simple style choices made for fun. A girl dressed carefully for a date the way a soldier might dress carefully for inspection, because her chosen outfit was read closely, discussed at length, and remembered clearly by absolutely everyone who saw her that night. 17 magazine, the single dominant teen publication of the entire era, ran regular columns coaching young readers on exactly this subject: what to wear confidently to a school dance versus a casual diner date, and how a well-chosen outfit could quietly say things about a girl's seriousness and respectability that she wasn't otherwise supposed to state out loud herself in mixed company. Rule 18. Parents fully expected a proper introduction well before things ever got truly serious, never after the fact once it was already too late to weigh in. Bringing a boy home to formally meet the whole family wasn't reserved only for engagement as a special milestone. It happened relatively early on and quite deliberately, functioning as a real checkpoint that the relationship had to clear before either of them dared to call it going steady out loud to their friends. That early introduction meant an entire family held real, tangible influence over exactly who their daughter ultimately ended up with, for better reasons and for worse ones alike. A disapproving father could quietly end a promising courtship before it ever had a real chance to become anything lasting, which gave whole families a genuine kind of power over outcomes that today, decades later, belongs almost entirely to the couple alone, without much outside input at all. Rule 19. A girl was never, ever supposed to appear too eager for a boy's attention, no matter how she genuinely felt about him underneath it all. Etiquette guides warned firmly against accepting every single invitation that came her way, gently suggesting a young woman occasionally decline even a boy she truly liked quite a lot, simply to avoid ever looking overly available or too easily won over on the very first ask. It sounds like a calculated little game when you describe it plainly today. And in fairness, some of it truly was exactly that, but it also functioned as a genuine, useful pacing mechanism underneath the surface. Deliberately slowing things down that way gave both people real time to actually get to know one another properly, instead of rushing headlong from a promising first date straight into a serious label that neither of them had honestly earned yet. Rule 20. The school dance itself was practically mandatory infrastructure for the entire courtship system operating underneath it. Sock hops held in the gymnasium, crepe paper streamers wrapped around the basketball hoops, a live band, or simply a record player wired straight to the loudspeakers gave every couple in town a safe, fully supervised place to be seen together openly in public, without a single whisper of impropriety attached to the evening. Being asked to the biggest dance of the whole season was its own quiet, understood announcement, almost as socially significant as wearing a boy's jacket around school every day. Teachers chaperoned patiently from the sidelines, parents handled the picking up and dropping off without complaint, and the whole event functioned as a fully supervised stage where courtship could unfold gradually in plain view of the entire watching community, safely and without much real risk attached. Rule 21. Writing was still very much considered courtship, not merely idle talk between classes. A boy might send a short, carefully worded note through a trusted friend, or slip a folded piece of paper quietly into her locker between periods. And a girl kept those little notes tucked away safely in a shoebox, the way people today keep old text message screenshots, except hers could be pulled out and held in her own two hands for decades afterward. Those handwritten notes were slower to compose, and slower still to receive than anything exchanged today. And that natural slowness gave every single sentence a little extra weight it might not otherwise have carried. A boy who took the real time to carefully write something down in his own actual handwriting was making a visible effort that simply couldn't be undone later with one quick tap of a delete key on a screen. Rule 22. Chaperones hadn't fully vanished from courtship by this point, even though the more formal parlor visits of earlier decades had largely faded away by then. Church youth groups, school dances, and larger family gatherings all still came with some watchful adult quietly present in the room, observing calmly from the edge of things without ever needing to actually say a single word to anyone directly. That quiet presence, even when nothing was ever actually said out loud, reshaped everyone's behavior simply by existing steadily in the room. Couples behaved noticeably differently when they knew a respected adult was somewhere nearby watching, and that gentle accountability was baked deeply into nearly every early stage of a relationship, long before anybody ever used a formal word like supervision out loud to describe it. Rule 23. Engagement itself came with its own strict, well-understood sequence that nobody dared to skip over lightly. A young man asked her father directly for permission first, well before he ever asked her the actual question himself, and that permission was treated seriously as a real gate to pass through, not just an empty formality, something that could genuinely be refused outright if the father had real reservations. If the father did say yes, the proposal that followed was often planned carefully around one specific memorable setting, sometimes a favorite neighborhood restaurant, sometimes that very same front porch where the whole quiet courtship had first begun months earlier. The ring itself, once finally accepted with a yes, replaced every single earlier symbol all at once, instantly outranking the jacket, the bracelet, and every wrapped ring that came before it. Rule 24 sat right at the very center of everything discussed so far. Each stage of a relationship carried its own visible, widely recognized symbol, and the whole town could read a couple's exact status at a single glance across a crowded room. Calling led naturally to going steady. Going steady led to wearing a jacket or bracelet. That led eventually to pinning or a ring, and the ring finally led, in time, all the way to marriage itself. That whole ladder gave everyone involved, the couple themselves, their circle of friends, and both sets of watchful parents, a genuinely shared vocabulary for something that today has almost none left at all. Nobody had to sit around guessing quietly where a relationship actually stood at any given moment. The symbol resting on her wrist or shining on her finger answered the question plainly before it was even asked out loud by a curious classmate. Rule 25, the last one on this list and also the quietest. The whole system was never actually meant to be equal across every American community, and pretending otherwise does the real history a disservice. These particular rules, drawn mainly from mainstream magazines and etiquette manuals of the day, mostly describe white, middle-class, suburban, and small-town life specifically. Other communities built their own rich courtship traditions in parallel through churches, historically black colleges, and their own tight social networks, some overlapping, some entirely their own. It's worth sitting honestly with that fact for a moment rather than rushing past it. The clarity these rules provided was genuinely real, and so were their real limits. Particularly for young women whose reputations carried lasting consequences that no boy ever really had to face in quite the same weighted way, even under the exact same rules. A full and honest picture holds both of those truths at once, rather than conveniently choosing only the more comfortable half to remember. By the end of the decade, the median age at first marriage in America had dropped lower than at any other single point across the entire 20th century, with women marrying around 20 years old on average and men around 22 and a half. The whole rulebook we've walked through was essentially built for speed, moving young people efficiently from a first nervous phone call all the way to a wedding faster than almost any American generation before it or since. That real speed came with a genuine cost that historians still point back to today when they study this period closely. Marrying young and marrying quickly meant plenty of couples committed to each other before they had truly gotten to know one another at all, a quiet undercurrent of real risk running steadily beneath all the warm nostalgia of jackets, class rings, and gentle porch light goodnights that people remember so fondly now. Even the sociologists studying this exact trend in real time back then were genuinely uneasy about where it was heading for young people. Going steady so young, they warned repeatedly in the pages of respected family magazines, could quietly lock teenagers into a fixed path toward marriage well before they'd ever had any real chance to figure out who they actually were as individual people on their own first. None of these rules ever stayed frozen in place for long, no matter how permanent they felt to the people living inside them at the time. By the early 1960s, the arrival of the birth control pill and a slowly shifting broader culture had already begun loosening the firm grip that going steady and pinning had held so tightly over college campuses for the better part of a decade. What felt utterly eternal in 1955 was already visibly fading away by 1965. By the early 1970s, pinning ceremonies and formal doorstep interviews had largely vanished altogether from American college life, quietly replaced by something looser, more casual, and far less legible to outsiders than what came before it. The single candle passed hand to hand in a hushed sorority parlor became, within just one generation's time, a ritual almost nobody under the age of 30 had ever personally witnessed for themselves. Here's exactly why all of this keeps circling back into conversation again right now, decades later. Plenty of people today openly describe real, genuine fatigue with dating apps, worn down by endless scrolling profiles and messages that so often lead absolutely nowhere at all, and a real hunger for something that feels more intentional and far more legible than an app that never quite tells anyone where they actually stand with another person. There's simply no modern equivalent of a porch light switching off at the right moment. No real modern version of a jacket that announces, without one single sentence spoken, that someone already belongs to someone else in a real and public way. That very absence is exactly why these old signals, imperfect as the whole world around them genuinely was, still quietly pull people in the moment they first hear the details described to them. It isn't really about wanting the entire old world back exactly as it once was, restrictions and all. It's about honestly noticing what real structure once gave people, even a genuinely flawed structure with real costs attached, and asking sincerely what a person today might still borrow from it. Real patience, a clear sense of stages, and the simple decency of walking someone to the door instead of just texting that you've arrived outside. Picture that same girl again, still standing quietly behind the screen door, while her father shakes the young man's hand firmly out on the porch. She has no real idea yet whether this particular evening will turn into a hopeful second date, a full, steady arrangement, or nothing lasting at all in the end. But she already knows precisely what each of those different outcomes will look like the moment it finally arrives for her. That's really the true difference between then and now, when you strip everything else away. Not that love itself was somehow simpler back then, and not that people were inherently any kinder to one another. It's that the whole path forward had visible, agreed-upon markers laid out along the way, and nobody involved had to sit around wondering, for very long at all, exactly where they truly stood with another person. These 25 rules were never really about controlling young people for its own sake, not even the strictest and most demanding ones on the whole list. They were a genuine attempt, imperfect and unevenly applied across different families and communities, to give courtship a real shape sturdy enough that two people could actually trust what they were slowly building together. One clearly visible step at a time, without much room left for confusion. And that's really the thread worth pulling gently from all 25 of these rules taken together as a whole. Structure and real warmth were never actually opposites inside this particular world, no matter how strict it might look from the outside now. The rules gave that warmth somewhere genuinely safe to grow, one recognized stage at a time, instead of simply leaving two people to guess blindly at each other in the dark for months on end. None of it was ever truly perfect, and it would be dishonest of me to sit here and tell you otherwise after everything we've covered together. But there was a genuine kind of mercy woven into knowing the rules clearly, in understanding exactly what a wrapped class ring or a quietly returned jacket meant without anyone ever needing to explain it out loud to you. That particular mercy is what so many people find themselves quietly missing now, even if they can't quite name it. So when you picture that same girl on the porch one more time before we close things out, picture her not as someone simply trapped by a rigid rulebook handed down to her, but as someone who understood those rules well enough to quietly use them to her own advantage, steering carefully underneath a script that looked, on the surface at least, like it belonged entirely to him and to no one else. That's the real story, quietly hiding underneath these 25 unspoken rules we've walked through together tonight. Not a simpler time exactly, if we're being honest with each other, but a genuinely more legible one, where love came with real ceremony attached to it, where courtship had an actual shape you could point to and name, and where every single person involved in it, fathers very much included, understood their own part in the whole arrangement. Looking back now at all 25 of these rules gathered together, what genuinely stays with me most isn't really any single one of them on its own. It's how much real, careful thought went into building a whole system where two people could actually trust each other's honest intentions before they'd said very much at all to one another. That particular kind of deep trust took real, Deliberate structure to build carefully, and it certainly never happened purely by accident. I genuinely think that's exactly why these old rules still reach people so deeply today, decades and decades after the very last class ring ever got carefully wrapped in yarn. Somewhere underneath all the porch lights and the nervous doorstep handshakes was a real, honest belief that romance deserved actual ceremony, that two people quietly building something meaningful together deserved a clear, shared understanding of precisely where they truly stood with one another. If any single one of these 25 rules struck a real chord with you tonight, the way your own grandmother might have once described her very first date to you, or the way a wrapped class ring suddenly makes sense of an old faded photograph tucked away in a drawer somewhere in your house, I would genuinely love to hear all about it down in the comments below this video, so please do share it with me. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight, and with all of these forgotten rules of courtship we've walked through together. If you want more of these stories, the calling cards, the promise rings, the quiet ceremonies nobody really writes down anymore, please subscribe and join me again next time as we bring one more of them back to life together, one story at a time.